In January of 1938, a grocery buyer named Harold Fenwick walked into the stockroom of a Kroger warehouse in Cincinnati, Ohio, and found 11 pallets of canned goods sitting under a tarpaulin in the far corner of the receiving bay. The shipment had arrived 4 days earlier from a distributor in Columbus. Nobody had signed for it. The receiving dock foreman, a man named Pat Oleski, who had worked that dock for 12 years, told Fenwick the truck had arrived at 4 a.m. with 2 men who were not Kroger employees, unloaded everything without being asked, and left before anyone thought to get a name. The receiving log showed the delivery time, the truck number, and 11 separate product codes, but the product codes did not match anything in the warehouse's inventory system or in the regional distributor catalog Fenwick kept in his office. When Fenwick pulled back the tarpaulin, he found canned vegetables, jarred tonics, and smoked fish products, items that had been moving through grocery distribution networks across the Midwest for years. He recognized several of the labels. His own mother had bought 3 of them. By the end of that week, every one of those pallets had been removed by 2 representatives of the Food and Drug Administration, who arrived without an appointment, showed credentials to the warehouse manager, loaded the pallets onto a government truck, and did not leave a receipt. Fenwick was told to destroy the receiving log. He kept a copy instead. He folded it and tucked it inside the back cover of a trade catalog on his office shelf, where it stayed for 41 years, until he gave it to his son the winter before he died. The first thing his son noticed was that none of the 11 product categories on that log appeared anywhere in the FDA's public record of food enforcement actions for 1938. The second thing he noticed was that several of those same product categories had simply stopped appearing on grocery store shelves anywhere in the country within 18 months of that delivery. Before we go further, if you find these buried investigations as fascinating as I do, hit subscribe so the next one finds you when it drops. The algorithm tends to suppress this kind of research, unless you tell it otherwise. To understand why those 11 categories disappeared, we have to go back further than 1938. We have to go back to a period in American food history that has been almost entirely overwritten by the official story of the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906. The official story is a clean one. Theodore Roosevelt read Upton Sinclair's account of the meatpacking industry. Congress acted, and American food became safe. What the official story omits is the 17-year period after 1906, in which a small group of food chemists, corporate lawyers, and government officials used the regulatory machinery created by that act not to protect the public, but to eliminate products they found economically inconvenient. Products that competed directly with industrially processed alternatives that certain companies had spent years and considerable money positioning for national distribution. Dr. Harvey Washington Wiley was the chief chemist of the Department of Agriculture. He had spent 20 years pushing Congress to pass the Pure Food Act. He genuinely believed it would do what it said. He resigned from the federal government in 1912, 8 years after the law passed, because he had watched it be turned against everything he had intended it to do. He spent the next 17 years documenting what had happened. In 1929, 4 years before he died, he published a memoir called The History of a Crime Against the Food Law. He printed 4,000 copies. It went out of print within 2 years. It was not reprinted for the remainder of the 20th century. In it, Wiley described in specific terms how food manufacturers had worked with sympathetic officials inside his own department to use the Act's enforcement provisions selectively, targeting traditional and regional food products while granting exemptions and favorable rulings to the nationally distributed industrial products that were, by any honest scientific standard, the more adulterated ones. He named companies. He named officials. He cited specific cases. The book is almost impossible to find today. A digitized version exists on a small archive website maintained by a retired pharmacist in Oregon who obtained a physical copy from a university estate sale in 2003. That is the closest most people will ever get to reading it. The 11 foods on Harold Fenwick's receiving log were not removed because they were dangerous. They were removed because they were in the way. The first was raw milk cheese, specifically the aged, unpasteurized varieties that had been made in American households and sold in local markets since before the Revolution. Pasteurization requirements began as a municipal health measure in the 1890s, targeting the genuinely dangerous raw milk being distributed in dense urban areas from disease-ridden urban dairies. What the regulations became by the late 1920s was something different. A 1927 internal memorandum of the National Dairy Council, a trade organization whose members were the large industrial pasteurized milk producers, laid out a 7-year strategy to extend pasteurization requirements from fluid milk to all dairy-derived products. The memorandum described aged raw milk cheese specifically as a consumer retention problem, meaning it kept consumers loyal to local producers and away from nationally distributed brands. The memorandum is held at the Wisconsin Historical Society. It has been there since 1953. It has never been cited in any official account of American dairy regulation. The second was sassafras root bark, the primary ingredient in traditional root beer and dozens of folk tonics that had been in continuous use in American households since the 18th century. In 1960, the FDA declared safrole, a compound present in sassafras oil, a carcinogen, and banned its use in food and beverages. The declaration was based on a single study in which laboratory rats developed liver tumors after being fed pure isolated safrole in quantities equivalent to a human drinking more than 500 bottles of root beer per day. Beverage companies that had already developed synthetic root beer flavorings were granted immediate approval to market those synthetics as replacements. The transition happened within 1 calendar year. Dr. Jonathan Hartwell, a cancer researcher at the National Cancer Institute who reviewed the sassafras study in 1961, wrote in a letter to a colleague that the study methodology was, in his professional assessment, insufficient to support a commercial ban. His letter is in the National Cancer Institute's archived correspondence files. The ban has never been reconsidered. The third was yellow dye from saffron, not the synthetic coal tar dyes that the FDA spent decades fighting, but real saffron, the spice, used for centuries in American baking and confectionery to color butter cakes, custards, and pastries. By 1940, synthetic yellow food dyes had become the dominant coloring agent in industrial baked goods. Natural saffron-colored products required a saffron supply chain that small local bakers could manage, but that large industrial producers could not standardize at scale. There was no formal ban. There was something more effective, a series of FDA labeling regulations issued between 1938 and 1943 that imposed compliance costs on any product using naturally derived colorants that were functionally impossible for small producers to absorb. The regulations did not target saffron by name. They did not need to. The fourth was bone broth sold in concentrated cake form, solid, shelf-stable blocks of reduced meat stock that had been commercially produced and sold in American groceries since the 1880s under dozens of regional brand names. They required no refrigeration, contained no additives, and provided a nutritional density per ounce that no canned soup product could match. Between 1933 and 1941, the FDA issued a series of standards of identity rulings that defined what a commercially sold broth or stock product was legally required to contain. The new standards required minimum percentages of water content. A concentrated solid broth cake, by definition, could not meet a water content minimum. The product category was not banned. It was defined out of existence. The fifth was calamus root, also called sweet flag, an aromatic root that had been used in candy making, digestive bitters, and medicinal preparations across North America and Europe for more than 3 centuries. American confectioners used it to flavor hard candies, chewing preparations, and stomach tonics. In 1968, the FDA banned it under the same carcinogen classification framework used for sassafras, citing a study involving a specific strain of calamus grown in India, a chemically distinct variety that American commercial growers had never cultivated. The FDA's own study files, obtained through a Freedom of Information Act request filed in 2004 by an herbalist named Michael McGuffin, show that FDA chemists noted the varietal difference in internal correspondence. The ban applied to all calamus regardless of variety. It has never been revised. The sixth was lard sold under its original name and composition, pure rendered pork fat, unhydrogenated, exactly as it had been made for 400 years in every culture that kept pigs. American housewives used it to make pie crust, fry chicken, and season cast iron cookware. It had a specific flavor profile, a specific smoke point, and a specific performance in baking that nothing else replicated. Between 1910 and 1950, Crisco and its competitors spent an estimated $60 million in advertising positioning hydrogenated vegetable shortening as a cleaner, healthier, more modern alternative to lard. The campaign was extraordinarily successful. It changed what a generation of Americans understood cooking fat to mean. No regulatory action was needed to remove lard from the market, but the FDA's 1938 Food Standards Codification quietly established labeling frameworks that required any product sold as lard to meet purity standards that incentivized processors to introduce stabilizing additives, a process that progressively eroded the market position of small regional lard producers who had always sold a pure, single-ingredient product. The irony that took 50 years to become clear: hydrogenated vegetable shortening, the product that replaced lard, contains trans fats. Lard does not. The American Heart Association spent decades recommending the product that was worse. The seventh was elderberry syrup sold as a medicinal food. Thick, deeply concentrated preparations of Sambucus nigra fruit that had been commercially produced and sold in American pharmacies and grocery stores since the 1870s as a treatment for colds, fevers, and respiratory complaints. The 1938 Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act drew a sharp new line between food products and drug products. Any food product that carried a medical claim on its label became, under the new law, a drug, and was therefore subject to the full pre-market approval process the FDA applied to pharmaceuticals. Small elderberry syrup producers who had sold their products with traditional claims for 60 years could not fund clinical trials. They changed their labels, lost their market position, or closed. The pharmaceutical companies that produced synthetic cough suppressants faced no equivalent burden. The eighth was raw apple cider vinegar in medicinal concentrations, preparations of 20% or greater acidity that had been sold in American markets for generations as a digestive aid, a topical antiseptic, and a general tonic. The FDA's 1962 strength and concentration standards for food-grade acidic products effectively capped commercially sold vinegar at 5% acidity for table use. Products above that concentration were reclassified as industrial chemicals. The medicinal vinegar preparations disappeared from grocery shelves within 3 years. They had been there, in some form, since American groceries first existed. The ninth was comfrey, specifically fresh comfrey leaves sold as a food and cooking green. A practice common in rural American households and in the immigrant communities from Central and Eastern Europe, where comfrey had been a garden staple for centuries. The same pyrrolizidine alkaloid concern that eventually led to comfrey's suppression as a herbal supplement was not the mechanism used to remove it from the food supply in the 1940s. What removed it was simpler. Comfrey could not be standardized, could not be grown at industrial scale with consistent yield, and could not be preserved or distributed through the cold chain infrastructure that was by 1945 the backbone of American grocery distribution. It was not banned in the 1940s. It was simply left behind by a distribution system that had no room for things it could not control. The EFTA ban on comfrey as a food ingredient came later, in 2001. But by then, it had already been gone from American grocery stores for half a century. The 10th was fermented grain beverages sold outside the beer licensing framework, specifically the family of lightly fermented low-alcohol grain drinks that had been common in American households and sold commercially under regional names before Prohibition. These included kvass-style preparations made from rye bread, fermented oat tonics sold at general stores across the rural Midwest, and barley water products that occupied the ambiguous zone between a food and a beverage. In immigrant communities from Eastern Europe and Scandinavia, these drinks had been part of daily life for generations. Children drank them. Farmers packed them in lunch pails. They were sold in grocery stores the way juice is sold today. When Prohibition ended in 1933, the new federal licensing structure for alcohol drew its definitions in ways that captured these traditional products and subjected them to the same commercial licensing requirements, excise taxes, and bonding obligations applied to industrial beer producers. A farmer who had been making small batch fermented grain drinks for his family and neighbors for 40 years was now a commercial alcohol producer under federal law, with all the paperwork that required. Small producers who had operated freely before Prohibition could not absorb the compliance cost. The product category ceased to be commercially viable within a decade, a category of beverage that Americans had been drinking in some form since the colonial period was gone by 1943. Not because it was dangerous, but because the new licensing apparatus made it easier to stop than to continue. The 11th was whole cottonseed oil in its cold-pressed, unrefined form, a golden nutty oil with a high smoke point that had been used in Southern American cooking since the mid-1800s. Not the refined, bleached, deodorized cottonseed oil that became a staple of industrial food production. The original product, unrefined cottonseed oil, contains naturally occurring antioxidants and phospholipids that are destroyed in the refining process. Between 1920 and 1940, the cotton industry's oil processing infrastructure was almost entirely consolidated by 4 companies that all used the refining process because it extended shelf life and enabled national distribution. Unrefined oil had a shelf life of approximately 6 weeks. The refined product lasted 18 months. The unrefined product, which had been the one in widespread use, simply stopped being produced. No ban, no order, no removal, just a supply chain that stopped supplying it, serving markets that stopped asking for it, in a country that had been quietly taught that the refined version was the same thing. Harold Fenwick's receiving log identified these categories not by their common names, but by product codes. His son spent 11 years cross-referencing those codes against trade catalogs, EFTA enforcement ledgers, and distributor price sheets from the 1930s before he understood what each one was. He published his findings in a 78-page self-printed monograph in 1991, distributed to 14 university libraries. 3 of those libraries still hold a copy. The rest reported the monograph as missing at their next catalog audit The FDA has never publicly explained why its 1938 enforcement records contain no entry corresponding to the Cincinnati warehouse action that Harold Fenwick documented. It is never explained why the receiving log product codes Fenwick's son-identified map with near-perfect precision to the 11 product categories that saw the steepest commercial decline between 1938 and 1945. It is never explained why the Harvey Wiley memoir, a book written by the man who built the FDA's predecessor regulatory function, was allowed to go out of print permanently, without a single reprint, a single academic edition, or a single citation in any official history of American food regulation. Why did the 1938 Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act Standards of Identity provisions use language that its own drafters, in internal correspondence, described as broad enough to reclassify traditional foods as illegal, without naming them explicitly? Why do the FDA's files for the Regional Enforcement Office covering the Cincinnati district show a 2-year gap in routine inspection reports, covering exactly the period between 1937 and 1939, when those 11 product categories were disappearing from distribution networks? Why would the National Dairy Council spend money in 1927 producing a detailed internal strategy document targeting aged raw milk cheese specifically if the regulatory outcome it described was not already considered achievable? These questions do not go away because institutions refuse to answer them. That is not a conspiracy. That is a pattern. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. The official history of American food regulation tells us that the FDA removed dangerous products to protect the public, and that what survived on grocery store shelves did so because it was safe, pure, and worth keeping. What the evidence tells us is that the regulatory machinery built to protect the food supply was used, selectively and strategically, to remove products that competed with industrial alternatives, and that the documentation of how that was done has been sitting in archives, incomplete, undigitized, and largely unread for the better part of a century. Your grandparents ate some of these foods. They would not recognize most of what replaced them. The question worth asking is not whether the people who made these decisions knew what they were doing. The question is whether anyone was ever meant to find out. These stories survive because people refuse to stop asking. If this matters to you, subscribe and share it with someone who needs to hear it. History does not disappear when it is buried. It disappears when no one looks for it. Next week, I am pulling a thread that connects the 1938 Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act directly to a specific meeting that took place in a Washington hotel room in September of 1937. A meeting that 3 separate attendees later documented in private correspondence. One of them was a chemist. One was a senator. The third worked for a company that had $40 million riding on what Congress decided in the following 6 months. The year the law passed, that company's stock rose 31% in a single quarter. You will not want to miss it.